August 1945. The war was over, but the fear had not yet ended. A transport ship crept into the harbor at Pearl, its deck lined with silent Japanese women. Their eyes were hollow, their uniforms stiff with salt and sweat. For weeks they had expected punishment, humiliation. Stories told back home had painted Americans as monsters. As the ship slowed, they braced for shouting guards, empty bowls, and the taste of watery soup. But when the trucks rolled them into the camp, there was no whip, no insult, only quiet efficiency, clean barracks, a nurse with a clipboard, and the scent of something warm drifting from the mess hall. The women shuffled inside, uncertain, gripping their identification cards as if for protection. On the long wooden tables, white bowls waited. Milk, cold, foreign, glistening in the morning light, and something golden floating in it. Cornflakes, a breakfast they had never seen before. They stood frozen. Some whispered prayers, others simply stared, as if this simple meal was a trick. But it wasn't. It was real. The war was over, and this small, ordinary kindness, was the first thing that made them believe it. The war in the Pacific had ended in a silence that felt heavier than sound. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito's voice, faint and trembling, declared surrender. Across Asia and the Pacific, millions of Japanese soldiers, sailors, and civilians found themselves suddenly without orders, without a country to fight for. Some refused to believe it. Others simply stared into the air, unable to process that the empire which had promised eternal victory was gone. Among them were hundreds of Japanese women who had served in the war, not as soldiers but as nurses, clerks, communication aides, and Red Cross volunteers. Many had been stationed in places like Saipan, Guam, and the Philippines, where the front lines blurred into chaos. When Allied forces advanced, these women were swept into the tide of surrender along with wounded soldiers and scattered civilians. Japan had never prepared its people for defeat. In propaganda broadcasts, surrender was portrayed as a disgrace worse than death. Women were told that Americans would torture or defile them. Mothers whispered to their daughters that it was better to die by their own hands than to fall into enemy control. In Okinawa, many followed that order, throwing themselves into the sea. So when surrender came and the women were captured alive, they expected the worst. The American military, however, faced a challenge it had not anticipated: how to handle thousands of Japanese prisoners, including women. The war had been fought with unimaginable brutality, yet the U.S. command had long insisted on adhering to the Geneva Convention, even though Japan had never signed it. The contrast between the two nations' treatment of prisoners would become one of the war's defining moral divides. For years, reports had surfaced of Allied POWs in Japanese camps, starved, beaten, worked to death. In places like Bataan and Changi, men had wasted away until they were skeletons in tattered uniforms. The stories fueled hatred across America, and many soldiers arriving in the Pacific carried that anger with them. Yet when the war ended, Washington ordered restraint. General Douglas MacArthur, now Supreme Commander of the Allied powers, instructed that Japanese prisoners be treated firmly but humanely. Every act of cruelty, he warned, would only feed the myths Japan's military had built. By late August, transport ships began ferrying Japanese prisoners from the islands to collection points, first in Guam and Hawaii, later to camps across the U.S. mainland. Among the waves of surrendering personnel were small groups of Japanese women, nurses who had stayed with the wounded until capture, clerks who had followed military units, and civilian volunteers swept up in the surrender. They were transported separately from male prisoners, watched not with hostility but with curiosity. American guards, many barely older than the women themselves, were unprepared for what they saw. The captives bowed, spoke softly, avoided eye contact. Some cried at the sight of food, others at being handed blankets. Many refused to eat at first, certain the kindness was a trap. In the eyes of their captors, they were no longer the faceless enemy. They were young, frightened women in tattered uniforms, carrying the emotional wreckage of a nation that had demanded absolute sacrifice. For the women, every step away from Japan deepened their sense of loss. They had been raised to believe their emperor divine, their mission sacred. Now, aboard ships under American flags, they were prisoners of the very people they had been told were beasts. The ocean wind cut through them like a reminder. Everything they had known was gone. When the first group arrived in Hawaii, the air smelled of salt and flowers. American nurses examined them, recording weights and temperatures, noting malnutrition, exhaustion, and infection. The women expected interrogation, punishment, or worse. Instead, they were handed soap, uniforms, and clean beds. The barracks were plain but spotless. Outside, palm trees swayed over the barbed wire fences, and beyond them, life in America moved on as if the war had never happened. At night, the women whispered to each other. Some spoke of the men they had left behind, others of families in Tokyo who might never know they were alive. One nurse wrote in her diary that she dreamed of rice and green tea, the taste of home, and woke up in tears. She did not yet know that the next morning, her first American meal would not be rice at all, but something called cornflakes. That quiet evening was the last moment of certainty they would ever feel about their enemy. The next day would begin to rewrite everything they thought they knew. By early September 1945, American camps across the Pacific began to receive steady waves of Japanese prisoners. The war had ended so abruptly that entire command structures had collapsed overnight. Men who once saluted the rising sun now stood in lines, heads bowed, waiting for rations. Among them, the presence of women was something few American soldiers had expected. They were nurses from field hospitals in Saipan and Guam, clerks who had worked in military offices, and even civilians caught near front lines when Japan's defenses fell. To the Americans, this was an unprecedented situation. Japanese women had never before been held in such numbers by foreign forces. Intelligence officers debated what to do with them. Some argued they should be kept separate from the men to prevent abuse or unrest. Others insisted they be treated with the same rations and medical standards as any other POWs. Washington sided with the latter. Every act of decency, they reasoned, was now an act of policy, proof that democracy could win with both strength and humanity. Geneva Convention protocols guided daily operations. The camps were designed not as punishment centers, but as holding facilities until repatriation could be arranged. Each barrack had sanitation, clean water, and scheduled meals. For American personnel, this was discipline, a demonstration of civilization. For the Japanese women, it was disorienting. They had been told that capture meant degradation. Instead, they were given toothbrushes, medical checkups, and even small booklets translated into Japanese explaining their rights as prisoners. Many of the guards were young Americans from rural towns, boys who had never met a Japanese person before the war. They carried heavy emotions of their own. Some had lost brothers in the Pacific. Others had seen the aftermath of Japanese atrocities in Manila or on the Burma Road. Yet when confronted with these women, frail, silent, and visibly terrified, hatred often gave way to something else. Pity. Letters from camp officers in Guam and Hawaii recorded their surprise. One wrote that the women showed no hostility, only confusion, and seemed unable to believe kindness was real. Another officer noted that many refused to meet his eyes, as if guilt itself was a physical weight. They bowed constantly, apologized for imagined offenses, and tried to clean their own quarters even when told not to. Meanwhile, back in Japan, news of captured women filtered through the ruins of Tokyo. Families were silent. The stigma of surrender was crushing. For centuries, Japan's martial code had worshipped sacrifice. The idea that honor was worth more than life. Women who survived captivity faced a different kind of battle, the fear of returning home labeled as traitors or fallen. Some wrote letters they never sent, unsure if their families would even accept them again. The American administration knew this cultural shame well. Intelligence briefings had studied Japan's ideology deeply. Psychological experts working under MacArthur recommended that POW treatment focus on re-education through decency. The logic was simple. Every small act of civility would undermine militarist propaganda that had painted the United States as a nation of sadists. The daily rhythm of camp life became a strange coexistence. Reveille at dawn, roll calls, health checks. The women were assigned light duties, laundry, food preparation, maintaining order in their own barracks. Translators were few, so communication relied on gestures, smiles, and silence. Over time, some women began to respond. A nurse from Saipan thanked an American orderly for medicine with a deep bow. Another timidly asked what cornflakes were when she saw boxes unloaded from a supply truck. The Americans laughed kindly, unaware that to her, that single question symbolized the first curiosity she had allowed herself since surrender. Inside the wire fences, the air felt suspended between worlds. Neither war nor peace, neither hatred nor forgiveness. For the American guards, each day was routine duty. For the Japanese women, each moment tested everything they had been taught. They still feared poison in their meals, still hesitated to sit before Americans, still wondered when the cruelty they had been promised would begin. It never did. The shift would come not through speeches or orders, but through something far simpler: breakfast. The next morning, when the women were called to the mess hall, they walked in expecting watery soup, perhaps a bowl of rice or a crust of bread. What awaited them instead was something they had never seen: a table of white bowls filled with cold milk and golden flakes that glistened like morning sunlight. That moment, so small, so ordinary, would become the quiet breaking point between fear and understanding. For the Japanese women prisoners, the first weeks inside American custody became a slow revelation of contrasts. Everything they saw defied what they had been taught to expect. The human mind, exhausted by fear, began to wrestle with a new and unsettling reality. And these women had lived through years of propaganda that dehumanized the enemy. In wartime Japan, posters depicted Americans as barbarians, soldiers who mutilated the dead and defiled women. Teachers, newspapers, and even children's radio dramas repeated the same warning: never surrender. When they were captured, that terror became physical. They refused to look their guards in the eye, bowed until their foreheads touched the dirt, and kept their hands folded tightly together. Gestures of submission meant to prevent provocation. But the Americans did not strike them. No one spat or shouted. Instead, the guards followed orders with methodical calm, guiding the women to showers, handing out soap, issuing clean clothing marked PW. It was not kindness born of sentiment. It was regulation. Yet to the women, it felt like mercy. One nurse from the Philippines later wrote that the first time she saw an American soldier smile, she felt both gratitude and shame: gratitude that she would live, shame that she had ever believed he would kill her. Emotionally, captivity turned their inner world upside down. Some broke down quietly at night, crying into blankets they didn't own. Others remained stone still, refusing to speak even to each other, fearing their words might betray disloyalty. Yet within those silences, something began to change: the first fragile recognition that their captors were human too. In Japanese society, surrender carried a moral stain that went beyond the battlefield. It was a spiritual failure, a violation of Bushido, the warrior's code that demanded loyalty unto death. For women, that shame doubled. A captured woman risked being seen as dishonored, even defiled, regardless of whether she had been mistreated. When the first reports of female prisoners reached Japan, they were often censored or reworded, described as missing rather than captured. In the camps, however, the Americans made no such distinctions. They addressed the women by name or number, treated them medically, and logged their presence like any other soldier. The women, raised in a culture of hierarchy and silence, struggled with this. Some couldn't understand why low-ranking guards spoke to them without formal titles. To them, it seemed both rude and strangely equal, a small but shocking reminder that the American idea of dignity was not built on rank or shame. The camp's daily life became a classroom in unintended lessons. The women watched how Americans moved, casually, confidently, unburdened by ritual. They saw men and women in uniform working side by side without scandal. They watched nurses who laughed loudly, soldiers who played cards, and cooks who whistled as they worked. The sight alone dismantled years of nationalist myths about decadent Westerners. These people were not demons. They were organized, ordinary, and in their own way, gentle. Many of the Japanese women had treated Allied prisoners themselves during the war, some as nurses in military hospitals, others as clerks managing records. They had seen cruelty firsthand. They had heard screams through walls, smelled death in rooms where prisoners were left too long. Now, to be on the other side of that equation, to be the vulnerable ones, was a reckoning none of them could have imagined. The Americans did not speak of revenge. Orders from the top prohibited it. Every guard knew the world was watching. News photographers occasionally visited the camps, taking staged pictures that showed POWs eating, smiling, working. But behind those images was a truth that needed no camera: that a defeated enemy, when treated with humanity, could begin to question everything she had believed about herself. One woman later recalled that the first time she was offered milk, she hesitated so long the glass warmed in her hands. She said it wasn't the drink that frightened her, but the possibility that it was sincere. that perhaps the enemy truly wished her no harm. For American personnel, the effect worked both ways. They too had been fed propaganda, stories of Japanese fanaticism and cruelty. They expected hatred in return. Instead, they saw young women too frail to stand, bowing out of habit, whispering apologies for taking food. The realization unsettled them. It was difficult to sustain hatred towards someone who looked at you with fear instead of defiance. And so, without speeches or declarations, both sides began to unlearn the war. The guards followed routine. The women obeyed quietly. Yet between those routines, an unspoken question lingered. If kindness could exist here, in a prison, what had all the hatred been for? The next stage of that unspoken dialogue would unfold through subtler motives, political decisions, propaganda goals, and post-war strategy. But for those inside the wire, it began with something more basic. Survival, slowly turning into understanding of how these women were treated. The U.S. military's approach to Japanese POWs was not born purely of compassion. It was also deliberate, a tactical and political decision designed to define the moral high ground in victory began in Washington long before the surrender. By 1944, American strategists understood that the war would not end simply through battlefield triumph. Japan's ideology was too deeply ingrained. Its people had been conditioned to see surrender as annihilation. To win the peace, America would need to dismantle that belief, not just through force, but through demonstration. Treatment of prisoners became a quiet weapon. Every photograph of a smiling POW, every letter describing fair rations, became ammunition in a psychological campaign aimed at Japan's survivors. General MacArthur knew this. His directives to camp, commanders were clear: no abuse, no vengeance, discipline with decency. The orders were not sentimental, they were strategic. America was shaping its image for the post-war world, an image of a liberator, not a conqueror. For the Japanese women, the effect was bewildering. They had expected the victors to behave like avengers. Instead, they found themselves inside an experiment in moral reconstruction. Even the simplest things carried symbolic weight. A clean uniform was not just clothing, it was a message. Proper meals were not charity, they were proof that civilization still mattered. Life in the camps followed a structured rhythm that was at once alien and strangely stable. Mornings began with roll call, then breakfast, then assigned duties. The women were not forced to labor. Most were given tasks that maintained their quarters, such as laundry, cooking, or assisting medical staff. American nurses sometimes allowed them to help with hospital work, which provided purpose to those who had served as caregivers during the war. The food became one of the most memorable markers of this new reality. The menus rotated between canned fruit, powdered eggs, bread, and the occasional serving of cereal, particularly cornflakes, a symbol of American normalcy. To the Japanese palate, accustomed to rice and fish, it was confusing, even comic. Many of the women at first refused to eat it. Cold milk felt unnatural, sweetness in a breakfast meal felt decadent. But hunger and exhaustion were powerful teachers. Slowly, they began to accept what was offered. Cleanliness was another quiet transformation. The Japanese valued hygiene intensely, but wartime scarcity had stripped them of soap, towels, and fresh clothing. Now, American-issued supplies brought back rituals of washing, brushing, and grooming that reminded them of dignity. Some began to braid each other's hair again. Others stitched scraps of cloth into makeshift ribbons, small acts of reclaiming identity. Language barriers created awkward but revealing moments. One interpreter recalled how a woman, struggling to pronounce English words, thanked him by saying merciful instead of kind. The word struck him because mercy implied power and kindness implied equality. The slip, he wrote later, was a truth too large for translation. Perhaps the most profound of all, for these women, captivity became an inward war. They had lost everything that defined them: their homeland, their cause, their certainty. What remained was confusion. In Japanese society, identity had been collective, tied to family, emperor, and nation. In captivity, stripped of that structure, individuality emerged painfully, one realization at a time. Some began to question what they had believed. If the Americans were not devils, had the war been built on lies? If kindness could exist beyond victory, had the suffering been for nothing? Such thoughts were dangerous to admit even privately, yet they grew, stronger each day. One nurse confided to another that she no longer hated the guards, and the admission left her trembling with guilt. She whispered that she felt as though she were betraying her dead comrades simply by feeling gratitude. For the guards, too, psychology shifted. Many arrived hardened by years of combat. Yet the longer they worked in the camps, the harder it became to see the prisoners as abstractions. A corporal from Kansas wrote home that they're just kids, not soldiers, not fanatics, just lost. That realization, quietly shared in letters and diaries, helped reshape American perception of the Japanese after the war. In these camps, ideology gave way to proximity. The women and their guards lived within sight and sound of each other. Every interaction chipped away at myth. There were no grand reconciliations, no formal apologies, just daily contact, gestures, eye contact, brief exchanges that accumulated into something unspoken but powerful. By late autumn, the camp routines had become almost ordinary. The fences still stood, but inside them, the fear had begun to fade. The women no longer jumped at loud noises. They started to walk upright. Some even smiled. What they could not yet articulate was that this slow normalization, this coexistence of former enemies in peace, was itself revolutionary. It was not forgiveness, and it was not friendship. It was understanding born from exhaustion. A quiet agreement between two sides that war had demanded too much, and that cruelty had no purpose anymore. That understanding would soon reach its most symbolic moment, not in a negotiation room or a battlefield, but in a mess hall, over a bowl of cereal and milk that tasted like nothing they had ever known. The morning light in the camp was soft, almost unreal. A breeze moved through the open windows of the mess hall, carrying the scent of disinfectant, boiled, water, and something faintly sweet. The Japanese women lined up quietly, metal trays in their hands, expecting what had become routine. A bowl of thin soup, maybe a piece of bread. Hunger was no stranger now. It had become part of life's rhythm. But that morning was different. The American cooks had prepared a standard breakfast, not for symbolism, not for any ceremony, simply because it was what American soldiers ate. They poured cold milk into white bowls and filled them with golden flakes that crackled faintly as they landed. The sound was light, almost cheerful, absurdly normal in a place still wrapped in the residue of war. When the women entered, they stopped. The smell was strange. The colors, white, gold, silver, seemed almost luxurious. For a moment, no one moved. A guard motioned for them to sit. They obeyed in silence, eyes darting between the food and the soldiers at the door. One woman, a nurse from Guam, whispered that it might be a test, that perhaps they were being watched for reactions. Another clasped her hands together and prayed quietly. The bowls of cornflakes gleamed under the morning light, waiting. An American officer, unaware of the tension, gave a brief nod to signal that they could begin. Spoons clinked softly. The first bite was cautious, hesitant. The cold milk shocked them. It wasn't sour, just unfamiliar. The flakes softened, their sweetness gentle and strange. Some of the women chewed slowly, as if unsure whether it was food or trickery. Then, almost imperceptibly, the mood shifted. A few looked up from their bowls. There were no shouts, no punishments, just quiet. The sound of eating filled the hall, delicate, rhythmic, human. A moment earlier, this place had been a cage. Now, for the first time, it felt like a room where people could simply exist. For the American guard standing nearby, it was an ordinary breakfast. But for the women, it was the dismantling of a myth. Every story they had heard, every image of cruelty burned into their minds, began to crumble in that silence. The enemy they had feared was not here. In his place stood men who gave them food they could not name and treated them as human beings. Some of the women began to cry quietly. They tried to hide it, turning away or lowering their heads. They were not tears of joy, not yet. More like the release of something long held and unbearable. The tears of people who had braced for horror and instead found confusion. The officer noticed, puzzled, but respectful. He gave them time. When one woman sank, Odin bowed deeply toward the kitchen. The gesture rippled through the room. Others followed, a silent wave of gratitude that crossed the gulf between victor and defeated. No words were spoken. There didn't need to be any. It was a small scene, unnoticed by history books, but it carried the quiet weight of transformation. The first meal in captivity that didn't taste like survival, but like something close to life. For the Japanese women, that breakfast became a symbol far larger than food. It was the moment they began to understand that the world beyond their borders, the one they had been told to fear, was not what they had imagined. It was a painful understanding, because it forced them to see how completely they had been deceived. The empire that had promised honor had given them death and defeat. The enemy that had promised cruelty had given them milk and cornflakes. Later, in diaries recovered decades after the war, some of those women wrote about that morning. One recalled the cold milk running down her throat like forgiveness. Another remembered the crunch of the flakes, the smell of the hall, and the feeling that the war ended inside me at that moment. What the Americans saw as ordinary routine, breakfast served, tables cleared, was for their prisoners the first tangible proof that humanity still existed in the ruins of war. And as they left the hall, some carried their spoons as keepsakes, small tokens of a morning that had changed something deep within them. They did not yet have the words for it, but they could feel it. The first warmth of peace, fragile and strange, settling quietly over their fear. Outside, the guards opened the doors, and sunlight spilled across the yard. The women blinked against it, their bowls empty, their hearts heavy, but less afraid. In that brightness, the idea of an enemy seemed to dissolve just a little. The war had ended by treaty and surrender, but for them, the true ending had begun here, in a mess hall with cold milk and cornflakes. That morning, after the women finished their silent meal, something invisible but profound shifted in the camp. The air itself seemed calmer, as though the world had exhaled. The guards collected trays, the cooks washed dishes, and the prisoners returned to their barracks without being told twice. Yet every woman carried the image of that breakfast in her mind, the taste of sweetness, the coldness of milk, and the absence of cruelty. In the following days, conversations began to flicker between the two sides. A few words of broken English, a few gestures, a few careful smiles. It was not friendship, it was recognition. The Americans realized that these women were not zealots or monsters, but frightened human beings caught in the machinery of war. The Japanese women began to see their captors not as faceless enemies, but as individuals. The guards, many of them barely out of high school, were often disarmed by the politeness of the women. They had been told stories of Japanese brutality, of kamikaze pilots, bayonet drills, and civilians who would rather die than surrender. But here they saw none of that. They saw young women who thanked them for every small thing, who bowed when handed a towel, who lined up quietly even when no one was watching. An American nurse who worked at one of the camps later wrote in her journal, "They were so gentle it hurt to look at them. You realize what war has done. It turned girls who should have been teachers and mothers into prisoners." Her entry was never published, but it captured the quiet revelation many Americans felt during those months, that the enemy was not who they thought it was. For the Japanese women, the adjustment came slower. Every act of kindness reopened an old wound. Gratitude felt like betrayal. To accept decency from the enemy meant admitting that their own leaders had lied, that the empire they had served had built its power on fear, not honor. Some could not bear that realization. They ate in silence, avoided eye contact, and spoke only in whispers. Others, however, began to change. They smiled hesitantly when greeted. They practiced English words. Thank you. Good morning. Milk. One night, as the guards made their rounds, they heard faint singing from one of the barracks, a Japanese lullaby, soft and nostalgic. No one stopped it. For the first time since surrender, the sound of a song crossed the wire fence, and no one felt threatened. The Americans watched quietly from outside. They didn't understand the words, but they understood the emotion, longing, sorrow, and perhaps the smallest seed of peace. Letters sent from the camps to command headquarters reflected this gradual thaw. Reports mentioned exemplary behavior, high morale, and no incidents. In a world still reeling from atrocities, from Nanking, from Bataan, from Hiroshima, this calm was remarkable. It wasn't just the end of fighting, it was the beginning of a new kind of understanding. Still, both sides remained aware of the invisible zone, a line between them. The women were prisoners and the guards were soldiers, but beneath that formality an unspoken empathy grew. When Christmas approached, American nurses decorated the infirmary with paper ornaments. They handed out small rations of chocolate. One of the Japanese nurses, unsure how to respond, made origami cranes from scrap paper and left them by the guard station. Those cranes became a small legend within the camp, fragile symbols of peace folded from the paper of surrender documents. The cultural barriers didn't vanish overnight, but the fear that had defined captivity slowly lost its grip. When the women lined up for meals, they no longer trembled. When guards passed by, they no longer flinched. The simple act of eating together day after day had retaught them what it meant to be human in a world that had nearly forgotten. For the Americans, the cornflakes were just another breakfast. For the women, they were proof that compassion could exist without victory, that mercy did not always wear a flag. They would never forget the metallic taste of ship air, the panic of capture, or the humiliation of surrender. But this one detail, this quiet morning ritual, became the moment they began to feel alive again. Years later, when some of these women returned to Japan, they rarely spoke of it. Their homeland, still bound by pride and silence, could not easily accept stories of kindness from the enemy. Yet in private journals and quiet memories, they carried it with them. The taste of milk, the crunch of flakes, the sound of American boots on wooden floors. Small, ordinary details that told them the war had truly ended, not with bombs or declarations, but with understanding. For those who lived it, the war's end did not arrive in a single day or with the emperor's voice on the radio. It arrived slowly, bowl by bowl, morning by morning, until one day they realized that fear had stopped governing their lives. The fences still stood, but the hatred no longer did. Inside that fragile peace, the world was being rebuilt, not through treaties or speeches, but through something as humble as breakfast. When repatriation finally began, the camps that had once held fear now echoed with an unexpected sadness. Ships were being prepared to return the Japanese prisoners home. The women who had arrived in silence months earlier now moved with steadier steps, their faces thin but calm. They lined up with their few belongings, folded blankets, issued clothing, and sometimes, hidden in their bags, a spoon or a small American ration tin kept as a keepsake. For many, the prospect of going home brought not relief but dread. Japan was no longer the place they had left. Cities were burned to the ground, families scattered, and entire villages erased by firebombing. The emperor they had once worshipped now spoke in a human voice, stripped of divinity. Even the meaning of loyalty had changed. They were returning to a country that might not want them. Women who had surrendered instead of dying. Women who had eaten food from the enemy's hands. During processing, American officers asked each woman simple questions: name, origin, rank, and health status. The women answered politely, though few could meet their eyes. Yet some exchanged brief smiles, gestures of gratitude that crossed the language barrier. When the ships departed, American guards stood quietly by the docks. There was no ceremony, no music, just the low hum of engines and the sound of waves. A few of the women turned back to wave, hesitant and small, as the distance widened. Their journey home was heavy with silence. On the decks, they stared at the horizon, wondering what awaited them. The sea, which had once been the empire's great boundary, now felt like a passage between two lives, the one shaped by war and the one waiting to begin. When they arrived in Japan, the reception was cold. The nation was broken, both physically and spiritually. Food was scarce, homes were gone, and the shame of defeat hung over every street. Repatriated POWs were often met with suspicion. The public, still clinging to notions of honor, viewed surrender as weakness. Men who had returned from captivity avoided discussing it. For women, it was worse. Many hid their past completely, pretending they had never been captured. Some even changed their names. Government records of female prisoners were minimal. They were not honored, not remembered. Official histories focused on male soldiers, battles, and losses, never on the women who had endured captivity and survived it with dignity. The silence was not accidental, it was cultural. In post-war Japan, survival through surrender was not considered courage, even when it required immense strength. And yet, beneath that silence, the memories endured. A few women wrote about their experiences privately, describing the confusion of capture, the fear, and the moment their enemy offered them kindness. One wrote, "I realized I had not understood the meaning of victory until I became defeated." Another wrote, "We expected the whip. We were given milk. That morning remains the day I learned that even enemies can have hearts." The physical effects of captivity faded, but the emotional weight lingered for decades. The women carried with them two conflicting truths. that their empire had deceived them and that their captors had shown humanity. It was a contradiction they could not easily explain in a nation eager to forget. Still, some spoke quietly among trusted friends or families. When younger generations asked what America was like, they spoke not of war or weapons, but of breakfast, of a white bowl filled with cold milk and golden flakes that shimmered in the light. They said that in that bowl, they first saw peace. Their stories, though rarely published, became the invisible bridge between two former enemies. Proof that compassion, even when born of duty, can heal something that weapons never could. As Japan struggled through the ashes of defeat, the United States faced its own reckoning. The nation that had dropped atomic bombs now carried the burden of rebuilding its former enemy. Occupation forces moved through ruined cities, distributing food, medicine, and leaflets promising democracy. But behind these grand policies, there was also a quieter mission: to reshape how the Japanese people saw America. And in that mission, the treatment of prisoners, especially women, became a moral reference point. American military reports praised the orderly behavior of Japanese POWs and highlighted humane conditions in the camps. Photographs of Japanese women in clean uniforms eating balanced meals were bulletins. The message was subtle but deliberate. America was not only the victor, it was the civilizer. Every image of compassion served as a contrast to the brutality of Japan's wartime regime. This was not pure altruism, it was strategy. The United States needed to demonstrate moral authority as it took on the role of post-war leader. The fair treatment of POWs became a cornerstone of its global narrative, that democracy, even in victory, retained its humanity. In classrooms and documentaries decades later, that message would echo again, that in a world broken by hate, mercy could be the ultimate victory. Meanwhile, in Japan, the women who had lived through those camps became silent witnesses to that transformation. Though they rarely spoke of it publicly, their experiences quietly contradicted the propaganda that still lingered in Japanese memory. A few wrote memoirs late in life, privately published and circulated only among family. One nurse from the Saipan garrison wrote that her time in captivity taught her that strength was not cruelty and mercy was not weakness. Her words, though simple, carried the weight of a generation. Historians would later rediscover fragments of these stories buried in Red Cross records, military archives, and oral histories. The details were consistent: the cold milk, the golden flakes, the American guards who enforced respect, the silence that followed breakfast. There were no dramatic rescues, no cinematic gestures, only small acts that restored dignity where war had stripped it away. For many of the Americans involved, those months in the camps became the most human part of their military service. A sergeant from Oregon, interviewed years later, said, "We were told to feed them like we fed ourselves. Some of them cried at the sight of breakfast. That's when I knew the war was really over." His words captured something larger than policy, the realization that compassion, once given, could not be taken back. Over time, these quiet exchanges, meals, gestures, brief smiles, built the foundation for post-war reconciliation. When Japan and the United States became allies, their cooperation was often described in political or economic terms. But beneath treaties and trade agreements was an emotional truth born in those camps, that both nations had seen the other's humanity in its rawest, most vulnerable form. The Geneva Conventions of 1949, drafted only a few years later, reflected this shift. The renewed emphasis on humane treatment of prisoners, especially civilians and women, drew directly from lessons of the Second World War. It was as though those small, forgotten camps, the ones where women were fed cornflakes instead of soup, had quietly rewritten the moral code of warfare. By the time the 20th century neared its end, only a few of the Japanese women who had lived through captivity were still alive. Some had become grandmothers, others had faded into anonymity, but when asked about their time in America, their answers were almost always the same, not about fear or punishment, but about food. One elderly woman, interviewed by a historian in the 1990s, smiled faintly when asked what she remembered most. "The milk was cold," she said. "I had never tasted anything like it. It was so strange and so kind." In that one line, decades of history condensed into something simple and eternal. That kindness, when least expected, can become the most enduring memory of all. In war, victory is usually measured in land, in surrender documents, in silence that follows the guns. But history's truest victories are smaller, measured not in conquest, but in moments where humanity refuses to die. For the Japanese women who expected punishment and found cornflakes, that truth came in the quietest form imaginable, a bowl of breakfast in a foreign land. That meal did not erase what had been lost. It could not undo the fire that had consumed cities, the soldiers who never came home, or the pain that lived on in memory. But it did something else, something gentler and perhaps more powerful. It reminded both sides that mercy still existed, even in the ruins of hatred. The Americans who served those meals were not philosophers. They were young men following orders, unaware that their discipline and decency were shaping a new kind of peace. The Japanese women who ate in silence were not diplomats. They were survivors, their lives reduced to waiting behind fences. Yet together, in that fragile space, they built something that generals and governments often fail to achieve: mutual recognition of humanity. The cold milk, the golden flakes, the morning light, these became more than symbols of nourishment. They were a quiet apology, written without words, a lesson in the language of decency. In those simple gestures, the image of the enemy dissolved, and something universal took its place. History often forgets such moments. It remembers the destruction, the politics, the speeches. But the soul of an era lives in its smallest details, in the way strangers treat each other when the fighting stops. For the women who once feared every sound of American boots, peace began not with parades or treaties, but with that first unexpected kindness. A reminder that even in the darkest chapters of war, the simplest acts, a spoon, a bowl, a quiet morning, can become the first notes of humanity returning.